Hi, thank you for joining us. I'm Vicki Goodman, and on behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our Open Mind program with Dr. Ellie Lebowitz, author of the critically acclaimed new book, Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD, a scientifically proven program for parents. We are honored to have Dr. Lebowitz here with us today, zooming in from his office at Yale, where he is the associate professor in the Yale Child Study Center and director of the program for anxiety disorders. We are also honored to welcome back to the Open Mind Dr. John Piacentini, professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCLA, director of the UCLA Center for Child Anxiety, Resilience, Education, and Support, better known as the CARES Center, and the director of the UCLA Child OCD, Anxiety, and Tic Disorders program. We would like to thank both of our preeminent scholars for taking the time from their busy schedules to share their knowledge and expertise with us today. Just a few announcements before we get started. The deadline for submissions for the Friends of Semel inaugural Open Mind Film Festival for high school students is Thursday, March 11th, just 2 days from now. We are so excited that high school students from all over the country have sent us scores of short films highlighting their experiences and concerns about mental health. Please be sure to join us on Thursday, May 6th at 5 p.m. for the Open Mind Film Festival, where we will screen the winning films and have a panel discussion about mental health in film featuring some of the talented student filmmakers and UCLA faculty. Details and the registration link can be found on our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org. We are also very excited to announce that WOW 2021 will be held on May 13th at 5 p.m. It will be a 1-hour virtual program with Lisa Kudrow host, featuring luminaries from UCLA Health and Science and noted celebrities to whom mental health issues are important, such as Ava DuVernay, Mindy Kaling, and Dolly Parton. We are proud to have People Magazine as our media partner. This is our only ticketed event of the year, and proceeds go to benefit the Friends of Semel Research Scholar Program and the Resnick Board's Clinical Innovation Scholar Program. Both fund and support early career neuroscientists and clinicians at UCLA. We hope that you will all join us for what promises to be a very exciting and meaningful program. Visit our website for more information and tickets, and watch your email for the invitation. One more quick announcement. Our next Open Mind is on Tuesday, March 16th. We'll be on bullying and cyberbullying and will feature renowned author of the new book, And Then They Stopped Talking to Me, Judith Warner. She will be in conversation with Dr. Sophia Nobel, co-founder and co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. Hope you'll join us. A few housekeeping notes. Today's program is being taped and will be available for viewing beginning tomorrow on our YouTube channel, which is located on our website. There you will also find a library of videos from past Open Mind programs, as well as a calendar of upcoming events, so be sure to check it out. Today's program will run for 1 hour, with the last segment reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible in the time allotted. And now, let's give a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Ellie Lebowitz and Dr. John Piacentini. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vicki. I also like to welcome Ellie, and it's really wonderful having you here. I'm sorry you're not here in person, because we would definitely go out after this and have some dinner and catch up and talk about all this exciting stuff that you're going to be talking about for us right now. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And we're going to start off with you reading a short passage from your book.
Great. It is fantastic to be here. I also wish we could grab that drink, but hopefully we'll be able to do that together soon. So I'm going to read just a very short passage from the book. Helping your child cope with difficulty is one of the most important aspects of being a parent. From that first time you held your infant for a shot, or insisting she go to bed at night, to making him go to school in the morning, parenting is often about making tough choices. Providing too much accommodation for children's anxiety can be like telling them they don't need the shot after all. It'll help them feel better in the moment, but will put them at greater risk in the long term. Ask yourself this question: what is the most important thing for a child who's vulnerable to anxiety to learn? I believe the answer is that the child can cope with anxiety and know that it's okay to feel anxious some of the time. After all, if your child is likely to experience a lot of anxiety in life, then the last thing you would want them to think is that she can't handle it. We want our children to believe that they can cope and to learn skills for coping most effectively. Thinking about anxiety like this makes it clear that an important job for parents of anxious children is to instill in their children the knowledge that they are capable of coping with anxiety.
Well, that was great. Thank you. And that really is the gist of the program that you're going to be talking about tonight. So could you define SPACE, the SPACE program, what that stands for? Presumably it doesn't involve rockets, although maybe. And then give a brief overview of what the program entails. And then we can go into a little more detail after that.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, there's no NASA involvement in this particular SPACE program. SPACE stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. And SPACE is a parent-based treatment, an entirely parent-based treatment for childhood and adolescent anxiety disorders and obsessive compulsive disorder, in which parents learn to respond to their children's anxiety symptoms and their distress in different ways to help their child overcome those problems.
Yeah, that's great. In our program, we also put a lot of emphasis on working with parents, although we typically see most of the kids. So I'd like to hear more about how your program differs, but I want to start with one of the concepts I really liked and resonated to was the way the parenting styles that you describe in the book and how these are so important for both potentially impacting kids' anxiety and also for helping the kids get better. And I'd love to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, so there are two patterns that we identify really commonly in parents of anxious children. And these are really natural ways to feel as a parent. One of them is what we call the more protective parent. And by protective, what we mean is a parent who views their role, their job in parenting their child as being primarily to prevent their child from experiencing distress. And that is an incredibly natural way to feel. What parent does want their child to experience distress? But when we make that the primary objective, we often get trapped into a loop of doing things to prevent any possibility of the child feeling distressed or uncomfortable or anxious or stressed. And what they're really not learning through that, what they're not getting in those moments, is that ability that I was just talking about in that little passage from the book, that feeling that actually it is okay to feel anxious some of the times, that I can handle that. Now, another pattern that we often see, and that's also really relatable and understandable, is what we call the more demanding parent. And by a demanding parent, what we're really describing is the parent who's very focused on, I want my child to get a grip. I want them to cope. I want them sometimes to even suck it up. It's the parent who's communicating to the child that they either shouldn't be feeling the way that they feel, or somehow should be able to act as though they don't feel what they genuinely do. And what we find is that sometimes parents vacillate between these two positions. So you might start out in the morning when your child's having difficulty getting ready for school, for example. You might start out more protective, trying to help them, trying to find all the different ways they might make it better. And then eventually you run out of patience And then it's like, okay, get your butt in the car because it's time to go, no matter how you feel. And then they might switch back to the more demanding pattern. But what neither of those patterns, neither the demanding nor the overly protective parent is really doing is what we try to help parents to learn to do in space. And that's to be a supportive parent. So not demanding or protective, but a supportive parent.
Yeah, and I imagine it's confusing for kids when the same parent at one point can be very protective and maybe echoing their dangerous fears, but it's okay, you can stay home or you don't need to do this. And then switching all of a sudden to demanding the child to do something that just sometimes even minutes before the parent was saying you don't have to do. Or when you have a father and a mother or two parents with the opposite patterns. That must be really confusing to the kids.
I think it is. And I think what you just pointed to is also incredibly common, where you have two parents and one of them is kind of falling more on the demanding side and the other one more on the protective side. And not only do children learn pretty quickly how to maneuver between those two parents in a way that's not always the most productive, but it's really a confusing message ultimately, because the child is learning about themselves and learning about the world, and they're getting some pretty conflicting messages.
Yeah, and then you talk about the goal is supportive parenting. So talk about that. How do you define a supportive parent?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in space, we have a really clear definition of exactly what we mean by support, because support's really a word that a lot of people could hear a lot of different ways. So if we just said supportive, I think it would be pretty open to interpretation. But we have actually a really clear definition. I would say that you're being supportive as a parent when you respond to your child's distress or anxiety in a way that's showing them two things. You're giving them two messages, and both parts of this message are equally critical and equally important. The first part is a message of acceptance, of validation, acknowledgement, just genuinely accepting the fact that this is what your child feels right now. And that can be as simple as saying to your child something like, I get it. This is hard for you. You are scared right now. It doesn't mean that you're validating that the thing they are scared of is necessarily dangerous for them, but you're accepting that that's what they feel. And that's the first half of support in space. The second half, though, is confidence, a vote of confidence in your child's ability to tolerate that distress, to get through it and still be okay afterward. And that can be as simple as saying to your child something like, I know that you can handle it. So when you put the two things together, I get that this is really hard for you, and I'm totally confident that you can handle it. That's when you're being supportive.
Yeah, those are really great concepts. Even parents that aren't anxious, with their kids, and their child may be facing a challenge, and sometimes the parents actually think, I'm not sure my child is up for this. I'm not sure my child can handle this. And sometimes it may be an honest appraisal. Sometimes it may be flavored by anxiety, where the parent is saying, I know my child is anxious and we fought this battle before and it didn't go well. So how do you get the parents of anxious kids or parents that may be anxious themselves? How do you get them to be able to project confidence to their children?
Yeah, it's a terrific point. And so many anxious children are going to have quite anxious parents as well. Lots of not anxious children are also going to have anxious parents too. But whether because of the high prevalence of anxiety in the population or because of the heritability of anxiety, it's very common for an anxious child to also have at least one parent, sometimes two parents, who are experiencing a high level of anxiety themselves. And that can make it more challenging to be supportive. One thing that I would say, though, to a parent who has coped with and maybe suffered from anxiety themselves is, wouldn't your life, just think over your whole life, wouldn't your life have been better? Wouldn't it be better all these years if you had gone through life knowing that, sure, you are going to be anxious sometimes, and it is going to suck, and it's going to be uncomfortable, but that it's something you can handle? Wouldn't it be great if somebody had taught you that when you were a child? It might have made your life a whole lot easier, and that's a gift that you can give to your child. Now, I'll also say that just a little bit of fake it till you make it is kind of okay. It's all right to say to your child, I believe that you can handle this, even if you're feeling just a little bit queasy inside. And it's not a dichotomy of your child can handle absolutely everything in the world, or they're completely overwhelmed by anything. You can say, I know you can handle some anxiety, and trust that that's true, because it is true. Children are resilient. They are able to tolerate anxiety. Even a child who seems very anxious and very dependent on their parent, they have the capacity to tolerate and to regulate some anxiety. So we start small, start making those sentences. And you know what? When you go through the week and you hear yourself saying that to your child, not only is it going to change how they feel, it's going to start changing how you feel as well.
That's a great point, because again, with parents that worry about their kids and may be anxious, and they're terrified, if I let my child do this, if they walk to school, if they go to the play date or the birthday party or whatever it might be, the parents are terrified. So seeing the kids actually able to start developing some confidence can be a huge boost for the parents, and it allows the parents maybe to have more better sense of their own judgment and their ability to tolerate anxiety as well. Because that's really what it comes down to, isn't it? Teaching the kids and the parents both to be able to tolerate a little bit of uncertainty or a little bit of anxiety, because that's kind of what life is all about, really.
Exactly, exactly. And I think one of my favorite things in doing this treatment and working with so many parents is hearing them at the end of treatment, after they have been doing this work for a while, and hearing them talk about how differently they see their child today, how much they have realized that their child is so much stronger and so much more capable than they would have ever believed possible. Because when you're jumping in there to rescue, you don't have the chance to actually see that your child is actually a lot stronger than you thought. And I just love hearing that feedback from parents at the end of treatment.
Yeah, that's great. So you talk about replacing accommodation with support. So let's talk about accommodation, because that really is kind of the critical factor in maintaining anxiety and also in treating anxiety from the parent point of view. So maybe you can talk about accommodation, what it is, and give some examples of what that looks like.
Yeah, this is a great question, because really space is all about two things. It's about being more supportive, and it's about being less accommodating. So understanding this concept of accommodation is really important. And what we mean by accommodation in the context of a child's anxiety or their OCD, what we're really referring to is all of those different ways that a parent is changing their own behavior in response to the child's anxiety, to help them not feel anxious, to prevent it or to alleviate it when the child is anxious. So for example, maybe you have a child with social anxiety and talking to other people makes them uncomfortable. So maybe you speak instead of that because you know it's hard for them. Or maybe you don't invite people to your house because you know that would make them feel uncomfortable. Or maybe you have a child with generalized anxiety, with all the chronic, persistent worry that comes in generalized anxiety. They're probably looking to you for reassurance. They're coming to you with all their repeated, endless questions about all the things that worry them. And you're probably answering those questions. So those answers would be the accommodation. I'm telling you again that you're not going to fail out of school, and you're not going to get sick, and we're not going to lose our house, and we're not going to die of this or that or the other thing. And you're repeatedly answering those questions. And that's the accommodation. Or maybe you have a child with separation anxiety disorder. Well, it's frankly hard to have separation anxiety disorder without a good amount of accommodation because you're so dependent on your parent always being around. So maybe you as the parent are sleeping next to your child at night, for example, because they feel anxious if they're alone. Or you're not going out in the evening because you know your child would be anxious. All of these different changes that parents make to their behavior, that's really what we mean by accommodation. And accommodation is almost inevitable in parents of anxious children. We have studied this again and again in every part of the world. We have data from United States and Canada and Europe and Asia and the Middle East and all over. And around 97 or 98 or 100% of parents who have an anxious child report that they are frequently engaging in these kinds of accommodation. What we also know, though, is that high levels of accommodation, the more you do that, even though you're pouring so much energy, so much time, sometimes even money and resources into trying to help your child not feel anxious, over time, those accommodations actually tend to maintain anxiety. So a child who is more accommodated is likely to have more anxiety next week or next year than they do now, which is just heartbreaking when you talk to parents and see how much this has taken over their lives and how hard they're working to try to help their child not feel anxious, and yet the child is getting more anxious over time.
Yeah, we see that with the OCD kids that we work with, where the parents are always washing or cleaning or organizing. Kids don't have to put out the garbage or feed the dog because of fears of contamination. And what you said is exactly right, because the fewer opportunities kids have to do these things or face their fears, the stronger the fears become. Because every time a child feels that if my parents go out, it's going to be really bad, something bad is going to happen, and the parents stay home, it strengthens the fear and reinforces the fear. The kids never get the chance, and it can be years and years, they never get the chance to actually prove that their anxieties or their fears or their OCD symptoms are actually incorrect. And it can lead to really bad problems.
Exactly. They're not getting the chance to learn that they can cope with those situations. And they're strengthening this belief that the only way that they could ever feel okay is if someone else rescues them. The only way that I can ever make my anxiety or my OCD feel any better is if somebody else steps in to rescue me. And the thing is, it's great if you have someone to rescue you, but it's a very vulnerable place to be. Right? It's great that someone can always rescue you, but it's really a vulnerable feeling to feel like you always need to be rescued. And a stronger feeling comes from feeling like, actually, I don't need someone else to rescue me. Right? Like, imagine if your child could only eat if you fed them. Well, it's great that somebody's there to spoon feed your child, but that's a pretty vulnerable place to be also, right? I mean, you feel stronger and more capable, and you're able to be on your own and function independently if you know that you can feed yourself. And it's true for anxiety also. You know, children have this system for down-regulating their anxiety that's driven by attachment. And just being near your parent can reduce your anxiety, and having your parent do all those accommodations can reduce your anxiety. But they also have their own internal systems for down-regulating anxiety. They have the capacity to overcome anxiety independently as well, but they're not developing that when we're always stepping in to rescue them through the accommodation.
Yeah, and then protection is, the protective parenting are very susceptible to doing this accommodation. So where does the protective parenting come from? I mean, some parents are very protective and maybe overprotective, others are less protective. Is there a way that this develops, or is there are parents born this way, or do they learn it?
Well, I think being protective of your child is just the most natural response in the world. And I don't judge any parent who responds protectively. I don't want my kids to suffer. I have 3 kids. I don't want them to suffer. And when I see them in distress, I feel that urge to protect them. Anxiety problems are like hijackers. They hijack healthy, normal, adaptive systems. That's true for the child's own symptoms, right? Like, we have a system for dealing with threats, right? The whole fight or flight system. And that's a healthy adaptive thing. But an anxiety disorder can hijack that system so that it runs wild. And suddenly my heart's racing in the wrong situation, and my breath is racing in the wrong situation. And just like anxiety can hijack the child's symptoms, it can hijack the parent's responses. Wanting to be protective of your child is totally appropriate when your child is in fact in threat. And parents are literally hardwired to respond to their children's fear in a protective way. And some parents are going to feel that more powerfully, and some parents are going to feel it a little bit less powerfully, maybe because of differences in their own anxiety or their own how they were raised and their own beliefs. But every parent is essentially hardwired to step in and protect their child and soothe their child when they're upset. And the anxiety disorder is hijacking that system and just making it run wild.
Yeah, we say the same thing. We tell parents sometimes it's in your DNA. You were born to protect your child this way. And actually what you ask parents to do in the SPACE program and what we do in our program, I often say, this is counterintuitive. It's the opposite. You think you're helping your child, and you are in some ways because you're making yourself feel better. But, with an anxious child, you actually need to do the opposite sometimes. And it's not always so clear or logical why. And in your book, you do a great job of explaining why the counterintuitive approach is actually the appropriate approach to this. So I'd love to hear more about how the SPACE program, how you address accommodation, how you work with parents to empower them to be able to do the things that can be really difficult to do.
Yeah, and I love the word empower, because I really think that this is a treatment that really is empowering. And there is, there's few things that I think are more gratifying for a parent than to help your child overcome a serious problem that they have. That's such an amazing feeling. And it's an amazing feeling from the child's perspective also, to be a child who has a real big problem in their life, but to have parents who know how to help them and we're able to help them overcome that problem, that is so empowering. But to your question of how we're going to address it, parents need practical, systematic tools, not slogans. And so we don't just say to parents, support good, accommodation bad, stop accommodating, go home, you're welcome, we're done. Because that's not an achievable goal, right? And I'm pretty confident that you don't do it like that in your program either. That's a great bumper sticker. Don't accommodate, just like face your fears, right? Maybe you do cognitive behavioral therapy and you do exposures, but it's not just saying to a child, don't avoid, right? Face your fears. You have to break that down into practical steps. And so we work through this really methodically, and parents reading the book can do it on their own in a really methodical way. We start by identifying all the ways in which you have been accommodating, and in a really non-judgmental way, right? Because of course you've been accommodating, just like 98% of all parents who have an anxious child. So we really will, let's walk through an entire typical day of your life and think about all the different parts of that day and what are you doing differently because of this anxiety. And then we'll pick one specific target. So we're not trying to stop all the accommodations at once, which would be both too hard to do and maybe even too hard for the child, right? You might have identified 20 different accommodations in your day. We don't want to stop them all at once. That would be pretty overwhelming. So we'll pick one specific target, something that you do pretty frequently, something that you have some control over and are able to stop. And then we'll make really clear, detailed plans for what are you going to do differently from now on? How much are you going to change that? Is it all at once? Are you going to stop it entirely? Maybe you're just going to reduce it 50%. And that's a good start too. And then we'll also inform the child about the plan in advance. We don't just spring this on children either. We'll let them know this is what we're going to be doing, and we'll let them know why. Because we don't think we're helping you by doing that. And we want to help you to get better. And we are so confident, back to that supportive message. We know it's going to be hard, but we're really confident that you can handle it. And then we'll start implementing that plan in a really methodical way. And when you approach it like that, in this really broken down into steps, systematic, practical way, parents are able to make really significant changes even within a relatively brief amount of time. And you start seeing your child feeling better and starting to overcome their anxiety, and it just motivates you to do even more.
That's great. So can you give an example maybe of an accommodation that you've used with a patient or in your clinic? Maybe something that would be early on in treatment and how you broke it down and how it was implemented?
Sure. And one thing that I think is really important to emphasize about this particular treatment, about SPACE, is that at no point in the whole treatment, whether you're doing it with a therapist or you're doing it on your own with the book, at no point are you going to be asked as the parent to make your child do anything. You don't have to make them practice a skill. You don't have to make them do an exposure, and you don't have to make them not do anything either, because all of this treatment is all about what you're going to be doing as a parent. And I emphasize it because one of the hardest things is when someone gives you advice like, well, you have to get your child to do X, but you can't, because maybe your child isn't really willing to do that thing. And then you start running into problems. Like maybe you get mad at your child for not doing it. And I know this would be great for you, so just give it a go. And then your child digs in even more and they start pushing back. And now we have a fight going on. In space, you don't have to make your child do or not do really anything. You just have to change the way that you're responding. So an example could be the child who's really worried, like the one that I described before, a child who's really worried and is coming to the parents repeatedly with a lot of questions. And a child like that might be worried about any number of things, right? Maybe, is my schedule going to change? And I heard on the news that cell phones might cause cancer. Are we all going to get cancer? Is everybody I know going to die? And also you said that that other thing is too expensive. And so wait, does that mean we don't have enough money? Are we suddenly getting poor? And you and dad were fighting yesterday. So does that mean you're getting divorced? And who am I going to live with when you split up? You might have a million different questions running through the child's mind. That's why having that kind of anxiety disorder is so exhausting for children, because your mind is just churning away. So we might take one of those areas. We might say, okay, we're going to focus on questions about health, for example. And other things we're going to leave alone. So I might even still be answering your questions about money and divorce and school and everything else. But when you come to me with a question about your health, something that I've already answered for you in the past, which is probably all of them, I'm going to remind you that I believe that you can handle it, and I'm not going to answer that question. And I know that's going to be really hard for you because your brain is going to continue giving you those thoughts and you're going to feel bad for a while, but I'm sure that you're going to be okay. And so I'm not going to answer that question anymore. So we'll limit it to that one particular focus, and then parents will start practicing that. And maybe for that first week, they're just focused on that one thing, but what they'll probably see by the end of the week is that those questions about health are starting to come less frequently. Because when the child does have that thought, they know the parent's not going to answer, and they look inward to how am I going to be okay anyway, because they're not answering me anymore. And they realize they can do it. And the thought passes after a while. And then maybe next week we'll build on that and say, okay, you did so amazing. We're so proud of you for the progress you made with those questions about health. And this week we're also not going to answer questions about another topic, and we'll just go step by step until the child is really feeling so much less worried.
Yeah, it's an incremental approach, the way you would learn how to do a lot of things. And it can be really, really empowering for kids and for parents. So this sounds great. So it may not work for all parents or kids. When we try this sometime with kids, and I know when you try this sometimes with kids, the kids aren't real happy about it. And they fight back. And sometimes the parents cave, and sometimes the parents get angry, and sometimes the parents are able to kind of stay strong. And these are all completely normal reactions. How do you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely true. It turns out, to nobody's surprise, that when you start reducing your accommodation, children do not universally embrace you and congratulate you on your deep understanding of childhood anxiety problems and your leadership as a parent. That is, it comes as a shock to nobody, but that's not the universal response of children. Children might get upset, and that can be really hard for parents, like just feeling really anxious. Maybe they have a panic attack, and that can be quite scary for a parent to see. They might get sad and cry. They may say some really tough things like, you don't care about me. If you loved me, you would do this accommodation. And sometimes they might even get angry and even aggressive in some cases. Now, one of the really best things in this context is exactly what I was saying before, which is bearing in mind that we're not asking the child to do something. And it's so important because it means that I, as the parent, don't really have to stick around to engage in an argument with you, to engage in a fight with you. I'm just following my plan, and my plan doesn't demand anything of you, right? It doesn't say you have to do something. If it did, then I'd have to stay and force it until you did it. Because it doesn't, I can simply say in a really supportive and warm way, I can say, wow, I see that this is really, really hard for you. but I know that you're going to be okay. And I'm going to be in the other room and get out of there. Because sometimes trying to stick around when your child is really upset, and even though you think you're doing things to help calm them, sometimes what you're doing is just making them angrier because they really want you to do that other thing that you're not doing. They want you to answer that question that you're not answering, and you just being there and not doing it sometimes makes them even madder. And so we prepare parents in advance for all of these possibilities. What if your child says, you don't love me? Maybe, how hard would that be for you to hear? And let's work through that. Maybe we can remember that what they're really saying to you is, this is hard for me, or I'm mad at you right now. And you know in your belly that you love this kid, and they know it too. And if they get angry, let's learn to recognize that before it gets out of hand. So when they start raising the voice, when they start getting red in the face, when they start getting physically close to you, learn to get good at recognizing those signs so that you can stay calm yourself and disengage from that situation before it gets out of hand, before they're breaking something in the house or throwing something on you. And we also make a lot of use in space of other people in the family's life that can be helpful. Maybe your child really did lose control and they broke something or they hit you or something like that. Don't get mad. Don't retaliate, right? You don't have to slap them or yell at them. That's not going to help them be less anxious. But you can get some help from people around. For example, maybe a grandparent can call up the child and say, I know you've been having a really hard time. And I also heard from your parents that yesterday you punched your mom or your sister or you broke something. I want you to know, I really get how bad you must have been feeling, but that's not an okay behavior. And maybe next time give me a call. And when we do that, children are dramatically less likely to repeat the behavior again the next time because we're conveying some public opinion that this is really not okay, but we're doing it in a supportive way that acknowledges that the child was upset, that they're not turned into a monster. We're not mad at them, but we also need to keep those behaviors under control.
Yeah, it's so important in parenting, and we tell parents, the calmest participant in the argument is going to win every time.
Exactly.
It's so easy to get hooked in or to get upset and start fighting. And I've never won a fight with the kid. The kids are really good at pushing parents' buttons. I tell parents a lot, you may do this too, it's like, I run a clinic, I wrote a book, you wrote a book also, and I say, it's really hard for me to do this. And sometimes I fail at it as well because we're human and all we can do is try our best to do this. And over time, as our kids grow and our kids get stronger, as parents in these situations, we will do the same.
Yeah.
But it's not easy and it's not necessarily linear. It can be a little bumpy at times.
Yeah, I love that. The calmest participant in the argument is going to win. I think that's a great line that I will also steal for our work with parents. So, well, we've been talking a lot about space, and reducing accommodation and being supportive. What other advice do you give to parents of anxious children that would, that could add to this?
Well, that's a really great question. I think we do a lot of the same things that you do, that anxiety is something that is a natural phenomenon. We talk about anxiety as nature's car alarm. And it's a danger signal. We're anxious usually in times of danger, but people with anxiety, adults and kids, their car alarm is set too low. And I always, when I'm doing workshops, I ask participants or parents and kids, how often do you hear a car alarm? Every so often. How many times have you actually seen a car being stolen when the alarm is going off? Yeah. Never. Yeah. So that's what anxiety is like. It's like your car alarm going off because of the wind, maybe a tree branch, but usually the car is not being stolen, and you need to learn how to recognize that and really look and see if there is anything, dangerous. And if it's not, you can recognize it as anxiety, and that will help you learn how to manage it. Same thing with parents, because parents react to their kids. And if the kid's anxiety alarm goes off or the kid's car alarm goes off, the first thing as a parent, we're going to say, oh my God, something's wrong. I need to help my child. As you said earlier, it's innate. So just trying to better recognize it, I think, is important, and learn how to conceptualize or react in different ways.
I love that about the car alarm. I do the exact same thing with have you ever heard a car alarm going off, and was it ever because a car was being stolen? And the alarm is such a great metaphor for anxiety. And another way that it's so similar is, or another thing that I'll say both to kids and to parents, is you can't figure out whether it's a real alarm or a false alarm by how loud it is, right? If the smoke alarm goes off in your house, you can't decide whether it's because you burnt the food or because there's a fire in your house by how loud the alarm is. That only tells you how close you're standing. It doesn't tell you whether it's real or not. And the same is true for your internal alarm. The fact that you feel super anxious right now just means you feel super anxious right now, but it doesn't mean that it's more true or more of a real threat than if your alarm was less loud and you were feeling only mildly anxious.
Yeah, absolutely. We just have a couple minutes left, and I have two more questions for you. And maybe we are done. I'm not sure.
Oh, please, go ahead.
The first question is, are there families or cases for which space might not be sufficient? I mean, the principles, certainly would hold, but for which maybe the child would need to be in treatment, or there's something in terms of the family dynamics that might make it difficult for space to work as a self-help program.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to be brief because I see we're getting low on time. But one thing that I will say is when there's a history of real trauma in the child, and a lot of the anxiety might be driven by exposure to an actual traumatic event, that's one situation where I think the child will often need additional supports. And you may still be able to apply a lot of the principles of space, but working directly with the child to address and process that trauma might be necessary as well. Other things that I would add, we are currently conducting the first ever really clinical trial of space for children with autism. And so we're still learning about that. I'm very optimistic about those results, but we have to be cautious about using space in the context of autism until we have that data in and can feel more confident. And the last thing I'd say is this is a program that requires a lot from parents. And it has to be a time in your life when you're able to do that. And so, if you're in the midst of divorce right now, if you're about to go in for surgery, if you're moving house next month, maybe those are not the ideal times to be doing space. If you yourself are maybe severely depressed as a parent, you might need to get support for yourself first before you're able to really be that supportive parent for your child. So these are some of the things that we would think about as we're deciding, is this the right path to be doing?
Okay. And then the last question is going to be more of a comment because we are out of time, is that, it's fantastic that you're testing space in research. There are a lot of different treatments out there for anxiety, for OCD, for just about everything. And it's so important for parents and consumers to look for programs that have been tested and for which there is evidence, because on the web, online, wherever it is, there's just a lot of material out there that hasn't been tested. And when our patients ask us, and I'm sure the same for you, what about this other program versus what you're offering? You have to go with the program that has the most evidence and the most real evidence. And that is such a huge hurdle for so many parents looking for help for their kids.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And that is why we really have been doing that methodical work of building the evidence base. We've completed multiple randomized controlled trials of space and really can speak with confidence to its evidence base. And it's important to be an informed and a somewhat cautious consumer of the services that are out there. So I definitely could not agree more with the point you just made.
Great. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. Let's do it again. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you.
I want to thank both of you, Dr. Lebowitz, Dr. Piacentini, for sharing all this knowledge and expertise with our audience. You've given us so much to think about. And I kept thinking to myself what I've always thought: parenting is the most difficult job in the world. And but you have given us so many tips on how to manage and do things in a different way. We have so many questions. I believe we have 49 questions and only 15 minutes to go through them. But I'm going to start with a question from Dave. He says, I like the "I get it, I know you can handle it" construct, but what is the response to your child when they immediately say, "No, I can't"?
Well, I'm going to do these. I'm going to try my best to do these like short answers because you said you have 49 questions.
Right. We won't be able to get to all of them,
We may
but
not get to all of them. I think the response is, that's what I believe. A supportive statement doesn't have to be an attempt at persuading your child. You don't have to get them to agree with you. You can say, well, that's what I believe. That's what I know, and just simply leave it at that.
thank you. From Ashley. What is your suggestion for a young child with social anxiety who constantly stays on the sidelines, watching others play, but won't join in due to feelings of anxiety, being overwhelmed?
Right. So the space answer to that is, anytime someone describes to me, this is what the child is doing, my response starts with, and what are you doing? Meaning the parent during that time. So are you sitting next to them? Are you speaking to them during that time? Maybe don't. Maybe be on the other end of the playground and let them be alone for a few minutes. You may find that they start inching their way a little bit closer toward the other children or toward the activities, etc. And so I really focus in space, we really focus on what am I doing as a parent that might be accommodating the behavior rather than directly manipulating the behavior. But there are also other tools that are useful in anxiety work as well, not only space, and sometimes breaking things down into small steps for the child. Maybe arranging a play date with two children that the child knows in advance are going to be there and not with a lot of other unpredictable children that we don't know are going to be there. So there's work that can be done directly with the child to try to gradually approach these situations. And there's the work that's focused on the parent in reducing their accommodation and being supportive of what the child is experiencing.
Thank you. John, anything to add to that?
No, I think that's great. I sometimes you need to work with the parent and the child, and again, more severe cases or cases where parenting alone might not be enough. Sometimes anxious kids don't have the skills. They haven't developed the skills because they don't go to birthday parties. They don't go to Six Flags. They don't talk in class. And sometimes they do need some help kind of relearning or initially learning some of these social skills or other kinds of skills that, but that goes along with the parenting. The parenting piece is really important. You need the parenting piece as well.
Okay. We have a pandemic related question from Kavita, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Given the pandemic, kids have been doing school from home for an entire year, making accommodation easier necessary for a household of 6 to function. Any tips on how to manage when the whole family is together 24/7?
Yeah, well, John, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this. But I will say, first of all, that we have all been living through a year that is, it seems almost engineered to exacerbate anxiety problems in children and in adults. If you got a team of anxiety experts together and said, what should we do to increase anxiety and drum up business? They might design a year like this, with so much unpredictability and uncertainty and all of what the question itself was describing. What I think is important is for periods of like lockdown and Zoom schooling and things like that, not to be a complete moratorium, a complete lapse in functioning. So to find ways to build in to the week, even when we are stuck in the house, to find ways to build in the coping with the kinds of challenges that children do have to deal with when life resumes. Because the big risk is actually not just that things are hard during the lockdown and the pandemic. A big risk is actually that then we start to ask children to go back and resume normal life, to go back to school, to go back to class, to go back to activities and sports and things like that. And suddenly they don't feel able to do it because they haven't been doing it. And something that was a little bit hard a year ago now seems insurmountable and just too daunting. So we're home. Maybe I can be at work even when I'm home as the parent. Now I'm in the other room and like mom is not home at the moment. Now she's at work, even if she's just in the other room working, so that the child continues to experience some separations. We continue to engage with social activities, continue to maintain routines and schedules and timetables, even when school is starting later because of this, that, or the other thing. It's just really important to build in that contact with the normal challenges of function so that children can get through this and still maintain those skills that really are jeopardized by these periods. But I really am curious, John, to hear what you have to add to this one.
I think that's exactly the same. COVID has really increased anxiety, and some of it is the anxiety is trying to sort out what is, CDC guideline, in terms of distancing and avoidance, and even, for OCD hand washing and all, and what goes beyond that, and what is anxiety or OCD. So when we're designing exposures or we're trying to reduce accommodation, we need to make sure that we're targeting the right symptoms. But that's exactly, Ellie, you're exactly right. I mean, we need to start getting these kids back on the horse now. And if it's not going to school, it's maybe walking around the block with a mask, or going to the park with a mask, or going with mom or dad or parent or somebody, starting to get them back out in the social milieu, especially as things start to open up, because it's going to be kind of a falling off a cliff, I think, for some kids trying to get back into school after so much time off. And the other thing is with Zoom school, a lot of the anxious kids are muted.
Yeah.
They turn their microphones off and their videos off. And teachers, well-meaning teachers are okay with that, or they may not be able to control it. So that's the first place to start.
Thank you both. Reentry is, I think, a difficult topic for many adults too, because we've been away from each other for such a long time. So thank you for sharing that. I think we can all take some lessons from that. We have a question here from Marilyn. What about children who are so anxious that they get an upset stomach or a headache? How does a parent deal with them wanting to stay home from school under normal, non-lockdown conditions? That's when they're going to school.
Yeah, actually, I think this is a great question, and it can be so confusing for parents, because when we think about, like, and putting aside COVID, let's forget for a moment about COVID, which brings its own challenges, because every child knows that they have an automatic get out of jail free card simply by saying my throat hurts or I'm coughing a little bit, and school policy dictates, as it should, that they're not even allowed to attend school until they've been tested, et cetera, in many places, and that's good. But let's put aside COVID for a moment. I think this can be really confusing for parents, because we're used to thinking, when it comes to school, we're used to thinking it's a simple thing. If my child is genuinely sick, then they should be home. And if my child is fake sick and is not really sick, then they should go to school. And when it comes to anxiety, sometimes we want to apply the same model and think, well, if they're really anxious, then I should keep them home. If their stomach is really upset because of this, or they're really having a headache because of this, then I should keep them home. Whereas if it's not so real, then they should go to school. But the thing is that what works for things like fever doesn't really work for anxiety. If a child has a real fever, then the best thing is to keep them home until they're better and send them back. On the other hand, when your child has real anxiety, that's actually not the best thing for them. The best thing for a child with real anxiety is actually to maintain coping, to maintain function, because it doesn't work the same way. You're not going to suddenly feel less anxious tomorrow if you stay home today. You're going to feel more anxious about going tomorrow. And next week, you're going to be even more anxious, plus you'll be worried about missing a week of school. And the week after that, you'll also be worried about all the kids who are going to ask you, where were you for the past 2 weeks? And so it accumulates rather than going down. And so what I would suggest to that parent is the same supportive approach that I was describing before, meaning I do get it. I'm not disbelieving you. I'm not saying that you're faking or that you're making it up. I totally believe that your stomach really is upset. But you know what? That's actually okay. It's going to pass. You're going to be okay. And anxiety makes us feel that way. Anxiety can make our belly upset. It can make our head hurt. But you're going to be okay. And yes, to encourage going to school. And I would say insist on going to school, because the thermometer model of, like, if it's real, stay home just doesn't work for anxiety in the way that it works for other, like, physical illnesses.
John?
I agree, absolutely.
Yale and UCLA are in agreement.
Yeah.
We have a question here from a teacher, Cynthia. Do you have specific advice for an elementary school teacher to use this strategy at school with a kid who is anxious?
John, do you want to take any of these first? I mean, I do have stuff to say, but I feel like I'm.
Go ahead, it's your show.
All right, I don't want to monopolize our time too much, but
If I disagree, I'll let everybody know, but I don't think I will.
well, okay, I will say this. First of all, I love the question. I really do, because I think it's fantastic that a teacher is asking and thinking about this, because it actually is really important. And even the term accommodation can be quite confusing in the school context. Teachers and everybody who works in schools is used to thinking about accommodations as necessary and often even mandated legally adjustments to ensure a child's learning. And that's the way that the word accommodation is used the most in the school context. And now here we're talking about accommodations as this problem that we should be reducing, and that can be quite confusing. But the truth of the matter is that accommodations of the kind that we're talking about here, anxiety accommodations, happen very frequently in school. The child who is socially anxious doesn't get called on because it's awkward, right? You call on them and then they're silent and they're looking away and there's this awkward moment, and then finally you move on. And after 2 times of that, you realize, you know what, let's just not put them in that situation. Let's not call on them at all. Or the child with obsessive compulsive disorder who is designated his own keyboard because he doesn't want to touch the keyboard that other children touch because of contamination fears, or lots of other accommodations. And the same way that accommodation by parents of that style of accommodation doesn't actually help to reduce anxiety over time, but maintains it, the same goes for the classroom. And so I would be encouraging teachers to take that same approach that we're encouraging to parents, not to give up on the child who is anxious. Take them aside, have a conversation with them, let them know that you understand that it makes them feel uncomfortable when you call on them and other kids are around and maybe look at them. You get that, you really do. But you also know that they can handle it and you don't want to give up on them, and you love hearing them speak in your class and you love having them in your class, so you're going to continue to call on them. But you could have a plan, for example, that says, I'm going to wait 25 seconds and then I'm going to move on so that it doesn't get too big. And the child knows what to expect and you've addressed it in a supportive way. And so I'm just using that as an example, but I would take that approach of being supportive for children in the classroom and not falling into excessive anxiety-related accommodations of this kind that we're talking about, because it's unhelpful in the end in class, just like it is at home. And communicate with the parents so that everybody is on the same page about it. We can make a plan together rather than, kind of working at cross, wires to each other.
Yeah, and I agree. And we're talking but having parent and teacher talk is important. And oftentimes what we try to do is have the school and home work on the same symptom, same issue. So the child's getting reinforced in both settings, and that can be helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you both. We're almost out of time, but there are questions here about if you, Dr. Lebowitz, have any space programs online that people can access, and Dr. Piacentini, if you have any programs, also workshops or anything online that parents can access.
So we don't have yet actual full treatment online in the sense of like automatic online, like a website that's going to do the treatment or an app that's going to do the treatment. That is actually a goal that is worth working toward, but we don't have that yet. What we do have, parents can visit, and providers who are interested in this also, and teachers can visit a website, which is spacetreatment.net. And that is kind of the online home of SPACE. And there are many resources there, including videos and books and articles. And there is also a list of providers who are trained in SPACE, with hundreds of providers in almost every state in the US, although maybe not every single state, but we're in the 40s, so it's so almost. And many of those providers can provide treatment online, like tele-treatment over Zoom or whatever platform. One thing I can say about SPACE is that it's a treatment that really lends itself to doing it over telemedicine, because it's an adult talking to adults, and that is actually easier than doing a lot of other child treatment modalities. And so while we don't have a fully automated kind of online treatment, there are many resources and there are many providers who can provide treatment online. So the website is spacetreatment.net.
and we have a lot of material through the UCLA CARES Center, which is carescenter.ucla.edu. A lot of parenting materials and videos and worksheets and things that they can use. We're developing a parenting course that will be online. We do some workshops at schools and all as well, probably similar to Ellie. So, but I think either one of these both of these websites would be great resources, and I would encourage people to check out both of them.
Thank you. I know we have so many more questions, but we are unfortunately out of time. Thank you to both of you. You've imparted so much valuable wisdom and knowledge, and we're really very fortunate to have had the privilege of listening to your conversation. So thank you both.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. It's been an honor to be here, and it's also been fun. And thank you, John, for the wonderful questions and conversations. It's been great. I hope you can come here soon, and we can go out for a drink together
That
here.
would be great. Yeah, let's go on the road. Bye, Ellie, and thank you, Vicki, for putting this together and inviting me to participate.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody for tuning in. And we'll look forward to seeing you next Tuesday And Then They Stop Talking to Me with Judith Warner. Thank you so much, everyone. Good night.
Bye.